Newest project is called It Must Be Christmas, and it's kind of a jazz Christmas album.
Something in David Phelps's delivery changed the last time most audiences heard him sing, "Love Will Be Our Home," and the people watching from the front rows say the change was visible, not in his voice, which remained extraordinary, but in his eyes, and in the particular stillness that settled over him when he reached the lyric about home being wherever your family gathers. That was the last time he sang it publicly. When he finally addressed why, the response from people who have spent decades following his ministry wasn't what anyone anticipated. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what drove that decision, why the people closest to him describe it as the most honest thing he's done in years, and why it changes the way you hear everything David Phelps has ever recorded. Stay with us, because what we reach around the 10-minute mark is the part of this story that the gospel music press has largely chosen not to address, and it matters considerably more than the headline suggests. David Phelps arrived in the Gaither vocal band in 1997, carrying a tenor voice that gospel music had simply never encountered before, and the range announced itself in the first notes he sang on a homecoming stage. Above a certain register, where other tenors strain and reach for the note, David seemed to open a door and walk through it, into a room other voices couldn't locate. Music directors, who had spent 30 years working in gospel, said afterward they didn't have the vocabulary for what they were hearing. The contributions he made to the Gaither catalog became the ones audiences associated with genuine spiritual encounter. His performance of "O Holy Night" at the Christmas homecoming events stopped rooms cold year after year. Via Dolorosa drew responses from people who described hearing him sing it as something close to religious experience. And End of the Beginning, the piece that became his signature across the homecoming world, turned into one of the most requested numbers in the entire history of those concerts, audiences calling out for it before David even reached the microphone. For millions of people who watched those early homecoming videos in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, David wasn't simply a featured soloist. He became part of the devotional fabric of their faith lives. People have written to Gaither Ministries for decades, describing the specific moments when one of his performances turned something over in them, a grief they'd been carrying without a name, an estrangement from God they couldn't find their way through, a loss they hadn't yet learned to grieve. That's the weight his voice accumulated across 30 years of ministry, and it's the reason what he has chosen to do now carries so much meaning for the people who have been watching. Before this story became what it is, David's public life had a shape that fans recognized and trusted. He had built a dual career, one foot in the Gaither world, the other in a solo catalog that ranged across gospel, classical crossover, and traditional Christian material. His departure from the Gaither vocal band in 2008 to prioritize his family and solo work, and his return years later, both happened in full view of a community that followed every chapter. Through both seasons, the public image he maintained centered on faith, on family, and on the conviction that home was his ministry's anchor. His wife Lori appeared alongside him in that story, the way homecoming spouses often do, warmly visible, part of the testimony. The songs David chose, the interviews he gave, the way he talked about his life, all of it pointed in one direction. "Love Will Be Our Home" belonged completely to that story. Written by Stephen Curtis Chapman, the song is built around one idea, that wherever the people you love gather, whatever the walls or the circumstances, that gathering is home, and it holds. David performed it at homecoming events, at church engagements, at Christmas concerts and special ministry dates for years. For the audiences who heard him deliver it, the song and the man seemed to belong to each other. He wasn't performing a lyric about something distant. He was describing something he appeared to be living. And that's where this story becomes more complicated and more genuinely human than most of what gets reported in the gospel music press. Court documents filed in 2023 confirmed that David Phelps and Lori Phelps had initiated divorce proceedings, and the news moved through the homecoming community the way painful news always does, in close-knit faith circles, carefully, with people unsure what to say and unwilling to speculate before they had to. The filings were public record, though, and the reality became undeniable in the weeks that followed. A marriage that had been woven into the public story of David Phelps's faith and his music was ending. But here's the thing. The gospel media largely didn't follow. In the months after those filings, people attending David's concerts began noticing a change in what he was choosing to sing. A show in one city, an event in another state, "Love Will Be Our Home," no longer appeared on the set list. At the beginning, nobody registered it as significant, because artists adjust their programs for all kinds of reasons. The pattern held through multiple tour dates across multiple months, though, and fans who followed his performance schedule closely started comparing notes. The song that had been a reliable presence across years of his ministry had quietly stepped back from his concerts entirely. When someone in a homecoming-centered online community raised the question directly, asking whether David had permanently moved away from the song, hundreds of people who had attended recent concerts responded to confirm what others were already noticing. According to multiple accounts from audience members at different venues, at least one live show included a moment where someone called out a request for the song, and David acknowledged it, paused in a way that communicated something without stating it directly, and told the room that particular song needed some space right now. He didn't say "not yet." The way those who were there described the moment, and the way the room received it, made clear he was saying "not again." And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle anticipated. What came back from longtime fans and fellow artists in the Gaither world wasn't confusion or disappointment. The response that emerged, in comment sections, in faith community forums, in the quiet conversations that happen among people who have followed Southern gospel for decades, was something closer to a complicated reverence. Grief for what the situation represented, mixed with genuine respect for what David was choosing to do about it. Because what he did by stepping away from "Love Will Be Our Home" was the opposite of what the music industry typically rewards. Most performers find a way to separate the catalog from the life. They deliver what the audience came for. They process the personal material off stage and off camera, and they keep the show intact. David made a different call. He decided he wasn't willing to stand on a platform and deliver a song about the permanence of home and the endurance of love when that particular home had fractured. That kind of artistic and spiritual integrity is uncommon in any genre, and the gospel world, despite its emphasis on authenticity, is not immune to the pressure of performing wellness. An expectation runs through Christian music that the artist's life should illustrate the lyric, that the testimony and the song should match. That expectation can produce something genuine and beautiful, and it can also produce performance that has no weight behind it. What David appears to have chosen is something different from either option. Silence on one specific song, rather than a cleaned-up performance of a life that no longer exists, or a full retreat from ministry altogether. Bill Gaither has continued to speak warmly of David in every public context since, and the community has followed that lead, honoring his ongoing ministry without pressing into the territory of his private life. That kind of institutional grace isn't automatic, and the fact that it's been extended here reflects something real about the regard David has accumulated across nearly 30 years of homecoming stages and gospel concerts. Fellow artists who have shared those stages with him have not spoken about the situation in ways that would complicate it. The silence around the song has been met, in its own way, by a corresponding respect from the people who know him best. What David has continued to do through all of this is perform. He hasn't gone quiet. He hasn't stepped back from the ministry or retreated from the platform. The concerts have continued, and people who have been in those rooms over the past year describe the performances as some of the most emotionally transparent they've ever seen from him. Not less present than before, but more so. Something in the willingness to acknowledge what he's carrying, not in words but in the choices he makes about what he sings and what he doesn't, seems to have freed something in the delivery of everything else. For those of us who have followed David's journey since those early homecoming stages, this story lands somewhere different than a typical piece of news about a gospel artist. We watched him build something across 30 years. We heard him pour that voice into music that became part of people's spiritual vocabulary, that showed up at funerals and baptisms and quiet mornings, when someone needed to hold on to a belief they were struggling to keep. We heard him sing about home, as if home were the most sacred thing a person could inhabit. And now we're watching him reckon with the distance between the song and the life, in public and in real time, without retreating. What this moment reveals about David Phelps is something that ultimately deepens the respect most longtime fans already carry for him. even though it comes entirely out of pain. The Christian community at its best has always placed authenticity above image, sincerity above performance. And what David is doing, declining to deliver a lyric that his life can't currently support, is one of the most genuinely Christian choices an artist in this space could make. He's treating the music as something that means what it says. He's refusing to let the stage become a place where he performs a version of his life that doesn't exist anymore. If you've been following David Phelps since the early Homecoming days, you already know what we mean when we say his voice was never separate from what lived underneath it. The instrument and the conviction were always the same thing, working together. And what this moment tells us is that the connection is still real, still governing the decisions he makes about what he'll bring to a microphone and what he'll leave in silence. The quiet around "Love Will Be Our Home" is, in its own way, as honest as any performance he has ever given, and that honesty is what this community of fans has always responded to most deeply. If you've stood in an arena and felt something move in you when David sang, you know exactly what we mean. There's one more part of this story that most people haven't connected yet, and it speaks to something larger about how the Gaither world responds when the lives of its artists become publicly complicated. David Phelps is not the first person in the Homecoming family to face this particular kind of reckoning between the music and the life. Michael English's departure from gospel music in 1994, when personal failures became public knowledge, was one of the most painful chapters in the full history of contemporary Christian music. The songs he had recorded, songs of commitment and devotion and restoration, took on a different sound once everything that happened became known. And what Michael did with that experience, years later, was return to the music, not carrying a repaired image, not offering a cleaned-up version of the story, but bringing something more complicated, and ultimately, more real. The redemption that gospel music has always sung about had happened to him in ways that were visible and undeniable. Guy Penrod faced his own version of this tension when he left the Gaither vocal band in 2008, the same year David departed, and navigated the particular expectations that come with having represented a certain image of faith and family across more than a decade of Homecoming stages. The pressure those artists carry isn't only musical. It's the pressure of being a walking testimony, of having people's faith expectations attached to your public life in ways that most performers never experience. The way each of them has handled that pressure, and the way the Homecoming community has responded, reflects something true about the values of Southern gospel and Christian music at their core, something that gets tested, and usually holds, when the stories get difficult. What happens next for David Phelps is something the people who love him are watching with hope and patience. He carries a voice that was given to him for a purpose, and 30 years of evidence makes that purpose clear. The songs he continues to choose to sing are carrying everything he's carrying inside them. And people who've heard him perform recently say the concerts feel more personal than ever, not diminished by what he's going through, but refined by it. Whatever comes out of a difficult season tends to show up in the music eventually. With David, it always has. Whatever comes next, the people who have followed this ministry for decades understand one thing without question. David's story isn't finished, and neither is his music. A voice built for worship doesn't disappear because the road gets difficult. It finds its way back to what it was made for, usually carrying considerably more than it did before. If this story stayed with you, the next video in this series will as well. We've been covering the full arc of the Gaither world through this season, and what's come out of those conversations is as unexpected and as human as everything we covered here today.